latest edition of SmartAging Podcast. SmartAging is a European Union co-funded project under Interreg Baltic Sea region, combining partners from Finland, Sweden, Poland and Germany, together finding out new solutions for assisted living. Today's episode is about the project itself, moving towards prototyping and piloting new solutions, as we have gone through a lot of benchmarking and need analysis of the aging population. Today I have a pleasure of having with me here in the studio Alex Myers, all the way across the pond from United States. My name is Pasi Rantanen and I will be the host for today's episode. Alex, amazing to have you here. And we both have quite a lot of experience about the startup world and new concepts in general. Can you tell me something about your side? How did you end up here?
Yeah, definitely. So I'm originally from San Diego, California, and my first job after college was at an electric vehicle startup. So I started working there and became their controller. At some point, I moved to another clean energy startup in San Diego. And then after, maybe almost a decade working in San Diego, I moved to Finland and came here for a master's degree.
And what is interesting, you're soon to be a PhD, right? Almost there. And the topic is somehow related to startups and entrepreneurship. What is that about?
Yeah, I will be defending my PhD next month at LUT University in Lappeenranta. And the PhD is about deep technology commercialization strategies. So how to bring scientific innovations from lab to market.
That's actually really, really nice. When we talk about deep techs, we talk about commercialization and we combine that with this project about healthcare and assisted living. It seems to be a pretty long way from the lab to actual hospitals, healthcare, assisted living facilities. How do you see that?
Yeah, well, actually, I think healthcare is an interesting concept because in addition to the technology element, I think there's also a social impact element. I've also been working along the way with social impact startups, and I think that they similarly face challenges that remind me of the work I'm doing for my PhD with deep tech, more human social interaction challenges, how to change systems rather than work against the laws of nature like a scientist, but constrained by what is. And I think health tech really combines both of those elements, potentially in a difficult and inaccessible way.
In Finland, we have at the moment a lot of NGOs, associations, basically people working almost for free to improve that side, to bring the human touch back to certain services. So can we actually never reach human touch ever again, or is it only about KPIs of filling something efficiently on healthcare?
Well, I mean, are you talking about the caregiving human touch?
Yeah.
So certainly that's one element of the human element, but I think the other element is the fact that health organizations are run by people and they have their habits and processes, and so even a purely technical play, whether it is enhancing or maybe enhancing the human touch of care or replacing it in the name of efficiency, runs against these human challenges.
This social interaction between humans, that's going to be in a focus for the next stages of our project. So people who are living in assisted living facilities, they live really independent life. They go shopping or visiting friends when they want. But at the same time, there's some kind of lack of communal activities. And I've been personally ranting about this for decades. In Finland, if you move to an assisted living facility and you still want to have your glass of red wine or a really good whiskey in the evening, there will be somebody telling you that, no, that's bad for you. And no, I want to have a bar next to my place of living at that point. So do you think that this could be something we can improve much more easier than the actual healthcare part of these services?
Well, maybe not easier because I actually don't know very much about the more consumer or social elements. But I would say that if an innovation or if a new business idea was aiming to improve the social life of residents, that they might find it easier because their customers might be the residents instead of the facility. So there could be a quicker path to getting people to interact with their product. And I think that, in general, a lot of technologies and a lot of projects can affect both, the health element or maybe the social or, more consumer element, and that can be an important strategic consideration for a startup.
This was something we found out. We made this research before the summer, like what are the actual needs of people. And one thing was all the time raised, especially in Finland, loneliness. So when you grow older, your circle of life is narrowing down, it's getting smaller for, multiple reasons. But like you said, that might be actually easier to solve the problems like loneliness, even with tech. Do you have any insights on this?
Yeah, and I guess it comes down to the nature of the loneliness. If it's really about genuine inner human connection, then I think technology platforms could potentially help to connect different individuals that might, benefit from that connection. It could be peers, other lonely people in assisted living facilities, or it could be other members of society that are lonely and appreciate having a local, maybe like an immigrant family that just moved, that, doesn't have any connections to people in their place. But then on the other side, sometimes loneliness is about, it's a one-way element. And for that, something like a chatbot, where someone could just express their ideas because they're not really seeking a larger connection. They just want someone to listen or something to listen, then maybe some technology like that could help.
Yeah, we see that in the shop in Finland every day. There's somebody having a long chat with the cashier just to have the daily conversation. Yeah. If we look, let's say, 20, 30 years forward, we will be pretty much only 35 then, both of us. But the society and the people are changing. So you cannot anymore offer only knitting or, let's say, collecting of stamps. You need to really think that people come with tattoos, piercings, they love really, really large variety of things. And you mentioned chatbots, for example. Now people say that nobody knows how to use a chatbot. Well, yeah, at that time, when we are living there, we definitely know how to use chatbots. So can we actually think about further ahead and what might be the next big thing?
Yeah. Well, I also think chatbots are an interesting technology for me because they're both let's call it pseudo source of knowledge, but then also an interface. So you could use a chatbot to chat with the language model and try to get information, and your mileage may vary in that regard. But chatbots are really good at being an interface to a tool that you might not understand. So even if there was a platform that connected different people with different needs, there could be a role for the chatbot to handle the onboarding, right? Rather than filling out a form, you're chatting with with an AI. So I think in some form or another, you're going to see ubiquitous chatbots, whether they're the interface or the other side of the conversation.
That's such a great point. I cannot, let's say, avoid taking a special guest on this podcast, and let's ask the chatbot themselves, like how they feel. You want to do the honor of asking?
Hi, ChatGPT.
Hey again. All ears and ready whenever you are. Let me know what you'd like to dive into.
I was wondering if you had an opinion about whether chatbots such as yourself could help people in assisted living facilities or other elder care situations to avoid loneliness.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm glad you circled back to that. I do think chatbots can be a really nice layer of support in those environments. Obviously, we're not a replacement for human relationships, but we can definitely help fill in the gaps, whether that's just having a conversation, answering questions, or even bringing a little bit of daily companionship. So I'd say yes, we can definitely help with that.
That is actually a really good example. Like in a couple of seconds, you can actually bring a chatbot to a conversation. It's not that difficult. But let's say other things as well. You've seen a lot of startups. I've seen a lot of startups. Do you think that there's something around kind of circles we are in that might be up and coming next on this topic? Assisted living, healthcare, this type of things.
Well, I think, we've already been talking about AI and specifically large language models as a frontier of innovation. But I think that the other areas of AI are really seeing some up and coming improvements for personal health and elder care. So I'm talking about the machine learning side of things where it's not just a language model, processing a bunch of information ambiguously, but actually developing a statistical model. We're seeing a lot of preventative health platforms like Aura that are doing that for all sorts of different data streams. And I've seen other startups that are maybe leveraging AI to help them process data that they wouldn't have otherwise been able to process, but creating the scientific background for a predictive or a reliable model.
Maybe something like 4 years ago, I was working with a startup that was founded by a lady who had not just one, but two PhDs about dental care. And they were creating AI model, like you mentioned, that was actually predicting the cavity before it was visible to dentist. And they ran some tests on multiple countries outside Europe. And that was validated, it was really working, it made the dental care easier, cheaper, and basically improved the life of everybody. But when they came to European Union, they couldn't get the permits to operate here. And that seems to be a huge problem in medical slash healthcare side, that it's quite difficult to get actually on the business. What's your opinion or experience on this?
Yeah, I actually am working with a project right now that is running into similar, it's a very early stage project, but it's running into, approvals about what might be considered a clinical study, even though it's a relatively simple lab experiment. I think that it's always a balance between setting rules that protect their, patients' health and the public's health, but also making them flexible or accessible. So I think, for example, in the U.S., there are exceptions for orphan diseases or other urgent situations. There are, pilot approval pathways. I'm not really sure how the landscape differs from the European Union, but I still think that whatever the roadblock is, if there is real value to be provided and captured, that a company can find a way through it and they can find the resources to overcome the barrier.
I take on that what you said, that if whatever the idea is creating real value for the problem or the customer, it will find a way. And this project that we are working with is a one way for startups in these countries, Finland, Sweden, Poland, Germany, for example, to get their first footstep towards the assisted living and actually piloting and testing their product or service in the real surroundings. Do you see that this could be, let's say, applied more by companies, this type of project, or is it just really nice small niche thing?
Well, I think I have two opinions on that because I'm a little bit conflicted in terms of, looking at the specific context of healthcare and then the broader context of startups. When I advise startups, I always tell them that solving a problem is a good starting point, but it is not enough to bring your product or technology to market. And that it helps to segment the problem in order to find maybe a relatively small niche where the problem becomes existential, where the problem switches from we help you use your nursing staff more efficiently to you don't have to close down your ICU because you don't have enough nurses, right? They're the same value, the same benefit, but the context is different, and one of them is existential. And the logic behind that is that the ICU that is, periodically being shut down due to a lack of staffing has a lot more of an incentive to experiment, pilot, and solve the problem. I think it's a mistake to ignore the risk, whether it's reputational, financial, or just opportunity cost risk for the company. If the product doesn't work, there's a reason they're doing a pilot. And the companies often approach that and they say, well, I know it works. So, it's really just about getting familiar with it. But from the company's perspective, it might cause other problems, right? It might fail to integrate with their systems and create some unforeseen issue that they now have to deal with, and they don't want to, right? So I think that the existential problem mindset is trying to account for that and still get in the door, even though there's that risk, because it's so important that it's worth taking that risk. And so I think that, that's not a commentary on projects like this. I think projects like this, and I hope would just be another forum for sending that kind of message to startups that, if your customer doesn't think your problem is that big of a problem, it's not a very comfortable position to say, well, you're wrong.
Luckily enough, I'm American enough because I've been watching a lot of TV series. So I know ICU, before you go to ICU, you always end up in ER or something like that. And before you end up in ER, you probably don't want to get there and then become ROI. So if we think about assisted living, you're able to provide something, a certain solution there, which prevents the customers actually ending up in ICU. Is it possible or is it impossible to actually calculate the return of investment on such a thing that doesn't really create value in the big picture? How do you see that?
Yeah, that's that's still creating value, but I think that can be a value capture challenge, where you're creating value for someone else and they're not your customer, or they are your customer and they're not paying you for the value. But I think that one way of looking at it is that, at least, for example, in my own experiences with family members that have been in assisted living in the US, there's this notion of in-home care, assisted living, or a nursing home, with different levels of care. And, there's a huge financial difference between those service levels, right? It's a big hit to move from an assisted living facility to a nursing home. And it's not a decision that's done lightly because of that. And so I think that if there are technologies that can help, for example, keep someone in an assisted living facility context, so that they don't need to upgrade the care level because this technology is helping them stay semi-independent. I mean, that's a difficult impact to track, right? It's I guess the assisted living facility now has a bigger customer base, but maybe they're full all the time anyways, right? They don't really need more people. So, you're getting into the market distortions from, the different healthcare systems and the way, the fact that the people receiving the value are not always the ones that are paying for it. But I think from a business perspective, it's more about just understanding that is true. It's not really something that can be fixed. Not all of the value that a startup creates can be captured or even measured, right? Some of it is out of scope for what they can monitor, and that's okay, because ideally they're creating enough value where they don't need every penny to be accounted to them because they're solving some other problem.
This will be maybe my final question, not promising, but we had a conversation before the recording about this value creation. Sometimes you offer value for your customers that you will solve this and this problem. We were talking about pulp and paper machines at that point. And this problem is actually not worth solving. because there's so many other problems that, make it futile to actually have this solution that you're offering. So we come to value creation. And do you think for a new concept, new idea, or new company, what kind of tools you actually recommend to actually check if there is any value at all that would create business?
Yeah, I mean, I think there are some tools and some actions. I'm not sure if there's a particular tool that can help, a wide range of startups to figure that out. But I think the action that gets the closest is that they should just talk to a lot of customers and not about their product, right? Not sales calls where they start by talking about the shiny new thing that they've developed, but actual conversations about the problems that their customers are having. I think it's far more valuable to spend, the metaphoric day shadowing customers through the processes where the problem supposedly exists, to find out what the real problems are.
I was, as usual, kidding. So we will end with these remarks and maybe your comment. What I've learned myself, what you mentioned about this, talking to customers, the US way of creating a company is listening to the problem of the possible customers and then creating a solution for that. The traditional Finnish boring engineering approach is creating a gadget and then trying to find somebody who might need the gadget. That's also the same problem between research and actual business. But okay, everybody knows this, at least in theory, you agree or not. But what do you think about the other way around? What you have learned here in Finland and in Europe that might be valuable to change across the pond?
Yeah, well, it's not really one or the other when it comes to, starting with a solution or starting with talking to customers. I think what I've learned here in Finland is that if you want to solve really radical problems, you have to start with some conviction about what the solution is going to look like, or else there's no grounding to go off of. But I think that, that's where I start to differentiate between science, research, technology development, and product development, right? That even if a technology venture is based off of 10 years of research, they didn't spend 10 years developing a product. They spent most of that time doing the basic research and the science that uncovered the mechanism, and then they started looking for what problems it can solve. It's not an open-ended search. It can't solve every problem, but it turns out that the way you apply innovation, the way you apply technology is just as important as the science that comes behind it. So it's an interplay between the notion of starting with conviction and being open to, change that conviction and learn from customers.
Thank you, Alex, for coming today. I don't know about the audience, but I could really keep up this conversation for hours. Maybe we'll start our own podcast series of something. I don't know, doesn't make any sense. It was really, really great to have you here, and maybe eventually in a couple of years we will have our own Huberman class podcast together about startups. Who knows? But thank you for coming.
Thank you.
And a special thanks to ChatGPT for joining us in spirit. We hope you all enjoyed and come back for the next one. That way it's got that little nod to our chat here.
Thank you for joining the SmartAging Podcast. That's actually really interesting to see that in a modern day you can bring new visitors to a podcast just in a seconds in a form of AI. What we learned today is a recommendation. No matter where you're coming from, you should really talk to your possible customer, to your possible solution provider, or maybe even to the possible researcher who can solve your problems. And unless we keep this discussion on between the famous triple helix, we will never get those new solutions to the market. Please follow SmartAging on LinkedIn, Facebook, and of course the podcasts every week.